to sort of get to the larger argument here also. And I want to put it in context of where we began, which was speaking about the possibility or the traditional theory that the Qur'an is in a poetic koine or in classical Arabiya. I mean, is this a revolutionary position that you would put it, that the Qur'an is in Hijazi? And just a reminder to the viewers, I mean, the Hijaz is the region of Western Arabian Peninsula where we find Mecca and Medina. I mean, obviously, it's you differ from the earlier Western scholars who have spoken about poetic koine. But how does this sort of position you vis-a-vis more traditional views? Maybe you want to bring up Karl Fuller's. I don't know if you want to speak about that. That's, you know, a German Orientalist from the early 20th century who wrote a book called something like Schriftsprache and Volkssprache, the written speech.
Other way around.
Volkssprache and Schriftsprache. Thank you. Yeah. So, So, you know, how revolutionary is this argument? How does it stand versus other arguments?
Yeah. Well, both revolutionary and not so revolutionary, which is always fun to do. I get to really say that the Islamic tradition is onto something in this case. So just to kind of finish up, just family thought. So, you know, a couple of these examples, what we see is whenever we have something that we can actually tell from the Quranic consonantal text, where there is a dialectal difference, it consistently agrees with Hijaz. One very weird exception, and I have an explanation for it, but other than that, it's, you know, I have like this list of like 40 differences, which are differences between the dialects. And what's important here is like, oh, some people have said, well, these differences were just being made up by the grammarians in order to show that the Quran was, of course, Hijazi. But the grammarians are not interested in that at all. They're very happy to say, you know, this form is from this dialect and it's in the Quran, and that form, and this is usually about stuff that is not in the Quranic consonantal text, but they'll often even prescribe, you know, they'll say, you know, this is the Najdi form, and you should recite it like that, even though, you know, it's clearly not how it was composed or whatever. They don't seem to see any conflict there. And besides that, we have grammarians from rival schools, Al-Farra from Kufa and Sibawayh, very important, both very important, by the way, from Basra, who are reporting the same type of stuff, and they're never using it to defend the Quran. So they're not saying anything that's in the Quran must be Hijazi. So these things are kind of separate, but at the same time, they're looking at this. So so it's within Western academia, and especially within the traditional Orientalists, this is quite a revolutionary point of view to take. So everybody basically always said, look, it's just, you know, the poetic koine, whatever that was, nobody ever defines it. It was classical Arabic, whatever that is, nobody ever defines it. Like, people seem to understand it as textbook classical Arabic, but if you would really ask them point blank, they would probably say, no, it's what the grammarians describe, which is a very broad kind of category, which doesn't really help us very much, because to the grammarians, both Najdi and Hijazi are Arabiya. They are part of classical Arabic. So which one of the two, you know, which is it? It could be all. And one other person that kind of had a different position here was Karl Fuller's, a German Orientalist who published in 1906 a book where he basically said, look, the Quran was originally composed in a vernacular language and was then changed and classicized over time by later philologists, so Muslim philologists. And he was shouted down by his contemporaries. Nodeke wrote a devastating review of his work without understanding the point. I think Vollers had a very keen insight into what was going on and kind of felt, you know, the issues that were there. He understood how important it was to use rhyme. He understood how important it was to use the reading traditions. And Nodeke accuses him of misunderstanding how the reading traditions work. But I think Nodeke is wrong about that. I think Vollers knew exactly what he was doing. He's working with very late sources because those were the only ones accessible at the time. You know, there's all kinds of issues with the book and even with its argumentation. But he saw a lot of stuff, and the main thing was like, how did we even know, especially in when you look at it as a linguist, and especially a pre-Islamic Arabic and how the Quran is written today, you would not write classical Arabic the way the Quran is written. because why wouldn't you write an alif to write a hamza, which is the normal way that has always been done before Islam? It's how the other Semitic languages do it. Why are you writing a waw or a ya or an alif sometimes to write a hamza? And he basically made that point. And then people, well, Nodeke, who was, of course, the most important Orientalist of his time, absolutely brilliant, I should add, but here he really made a mistake. He basically burned it down, and afterwards it was considered absolutely toxic, and people just never really touched it again. People sometimes, cite Vollers to say, well, everybody knows that he's wrong. It's like, well, I mean, Nodeke didn't show that he was wrong. Actually, I mean, I think Vollers is wrong on a lot of things, but nobody ever bothered to show that it was wrong. And only Jonathan Owens, a fellow linguist and dialectologist, once pointed out, like, well, Nodeke basically shouted him down, and his career just ended.
Not the only time, sadly, that kind of thing went down in academia.
Yeah, it's really shocking. But so within Western academia, if we want to use it, or let's call it Orientalists in this case, because that's really what they were at the time. That this never took off. They were always like, any suggestion that the Quran was written in the vernacular is pure propaganda for the Quraysh, that was the tribe of Muhammad, who were trying to show that their language was the best language, so we should just discard it. But actually, and that's the thing, there are tons of traditions that say, write down the Quran in the Qurayshi dialect, because it was revealed in that way. And those are pretty good traditions. Like, we can't trace it back all the way to the people that they're attributed to, but they're early. So we get these kind of traditions from, great names like Ibn Shihab az-Zuhri, which, without him, there will be no Islam, not the way we know it. And so we have these kinds of reports, and we have reports of like, Ibn Mas'ud, one of the companions of the Prophet, reciting in a certain way, and another person saying, like, why are you reciting it like this? It's like, well, I'm just reciting in the Hudayl dialect. And he's like, you can't do that. You have to recite it in the Quraysh way. So we have all these kind of traditions around talking about that you should be either recite the Quran in the Quraysh way, or that at least the Quran was written in the Quraysh way or revealed in the Quraysh way. And these are good, fairly good traditions. And what's interesting about it is, even though the Orientalists always said, well, this is just propaganda for the Quraysh, and it was obviously just written in classical Arabic, nobody ever uses this for propagandistic purposes. They never, it would be very beneficial for a Hijazi reader to say, well, I recited like this way because it's the way that the Quraysh did it, and I follow the way of the Quraysh. But they don't. Very often, they very explicitly do not follow that. Al-Farra, the Kufan grammarian I mentioned already, was a direct student of Al-Kisai, and Al-Kisai reads tons of things which are explicitly admitted by Al-Farra are not Hijazi ways of doing it. So what's going on there? It doesn't have that kind of function that it has been accorded. That's just because all the Orientalists were working within kind of framework, thinking about this, that the classical Arabic was the greatest thing ever, and therefore everything must be like classical Arabic. And they just projected that onto the early philologists, which just did not have that framework at all.
Marijn, aren't there also certain assumptions within Islam about the nature of the text and its transmission, which are sort of destabilized by some of your arguments? I mean, there are these traditions about the Quran being revealed in the dialect of Quraysh, but there is a standard, at least I hear it, I don't actually know, maybe this is more modern apologetics, but that the Quran is pure Arabiya. I mean, this is something I hear often from Muslim friends and just reading scholarship, especially online. And this, I mean, let me give one more example. So maybe you want to comment on that, but let me throw in another example. For example, the orthography of certain words with a waw, and you've alluded to this, but like the words for salat, I think mishkat is written this way, hayat, zakat is definitely one of them. They're all written with a waw. But they're pronounced with basically an aleph. So, I mean, and I think your argument is, no, they've been pronounced incorrectly. Of course, a believer might have other ways theologically of working through it. But I mean, in terms of the primitive phonology of the text, in the Hijaz, it would have been pronounced something like solot or hayot. Is that right?
Yeah. I'll approach it from two sides. So, on the one hand, pure Arabiya. Well, Hijazi is Arabiya, right? So if you read the grammarians, they'll tell you what Arabiya is. They'll tell you all the things that are good, and they'll tell you all these things that we've mentioned so far, including the one that you just mentioned, are things that are perfectly acceptable Arabiya, whatever that is. And the Quran constantly tells its audience that it's Arabi. Right. Or Arabi Mubin, which I think this is an argument that Ahmad Jalal put together. It is explicitly saying, look, this is a text and it should be understood by the people, and that's why it's in Arabic. So it's specifically about the vernacular nature and not about the classical Arabic nature of the text, which is how it's sometimes been understood. So taking this example of these words like we very often say salat these days with the final T, but the proper classical Arabic pronunciation is salah. But taking those, indeed, they're written with waw. And what's interesting about them is that Sibawayh explicitly says, one, that words like hayat, so hayat, salat, and zakat, I think he mentions, those are the three. And he writes them with, well, at least in the editions that we have, he writes them with alifs, which is the modern classical spelling. It's okay to pronounce these with an alif at-tafkhim, as he calls it, for Quranic recitation, explicitly for Quranic recitation. And this is the way that the people of the Hijaz do it. So he's saying these words should be pronounced as hayo and zakoh and saloh. So he's one saying this is the way to do it. That's why it's written with a waw. I mean, that's not how he explains, but actually some later philologists do explain it that way, and it's how I would explain it and how Ahmad Jalad has explained it. And he's explicitly saying it's okay to recite the Quran that way, and it's the way the people of the Hijaz do it. And we have a Hijaz document that is spelling it that way. I would say 101 is 2, and that should be the proper way of pronouncing it. Of course, that is not how anyone pronounces it today. And it's actually, I think it's quite unlikely that at the time that Sibawayh is writing, who's basically contemporary with the canonical readers, many people were reciting it that way. But still, he says it's okay. And he's a Basran. He certainly knew and has heard recited Abu Amr, the canonical reader. He doesn't say Saloh, he says Salah, and he says Haya. So these things are not, and so there was really a clear flexibility with what you could do with language. It was perfectly fine to use these different dialectal forms, and that seems to have been, to some extent, occasioned by this famous hadith, the Sabat Haruf hadith, the 7 modes, 7 letters, 7 right, whatever you want to call it, right. Which seems to be a hadith that is explicitly permissive of variants. It's not so clear that they were talking about these kinds of variants, and not something maybe a bit more subversive, like wording being much more different and not so much arguing about the vowels. I think vowel things was like, I mean, what are you talking about? This is just dialect stuff. We just do whatever we like, and we do what is pretty, or what is fashionable, these kinds of things. But it's certainly understood that way, and certainly like early philologists do start explaining these kind of variations through that kind of license, and that's how it's very often done today.
Okay, yeah, that's a really helpful way of putting it. Sort of asking what is Arabiya, why is Hijazi dialect? Yeah, that is Arabiya. So that I think that's really helpful.